Well, for a few weeks now, we've been talking specifically about prayer. And Tina continued that conversation beautifully for us in her opening words this morning. We've talked about a couple of prayers, a couple of style of prayers. One Sunday we talked about a form of prayer called ACTS, A-C-T-S, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. Last Sunday we talked about the prayer that Jesus said we should say, the Lord's Prayer, focusing especially on that part about bread. Today I want to talk again about prayer, but perhaps more about our attitude as we approach prayer. I want to encourage us to pray boldly. Pray boldly. When we're getting ready to turn to God in prayer, let's be brave and daring. Hey, Larry, you go first. Be brave. Don't wait for someone else. We can do it ourselves. It's kind of surprising to me as I reflect on this topic and think about some of the things we've talked about already, especially the Lord's Prayer. I've often been struck by how demanding a prayer that is. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive our sins. Lead us not into temptation. It's kind of bossy, isn't it? And yet, Jesus encouraged us to tell God exactly what we need. Ask, he said, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds, and they who knock, to them the door will be opened. Jesus says, be bold. Go ahead. Ask. But I wonder if sometimes this is hard for us. If you're a timid kind of person, it's hard to be bold, even when talking to God. If you're like me and you were raised to be polite, it seems like we ought to add a few more words in there, like, God, if it's not too much trouble, would you be willing to do this for us? Would you mind? Don't want to be too demanding here. I'm tempted to add a few other little phrases into the Lord's Prayer. But Jesus didn't. Jesus said, be bold. Well, maybe sometimes it's hard to pray not because we're timid or not because we're worried about being polite, but maybe it's because we're trying to remember all those formulas that we learned in church. Was it A-T-S-Q-Y? What was it again? Adoration, and what does the S stand for? We can get really hung up on that. That formula is only meant to be helpful. If it's not helpful, don't use it. When I was young, I used to get caught up in the whole King James English thing, because the pastor of my church, it was the most remarkable thing. He would talk normally like me, and then when he talked to God, suddenly he changed, and he started using thee and thou and thine, and I used to just listen and marvel and think, I could never pray like that, because I'd get confused about the grammar. Ironically, during a former church, I had to actually learn how to speak that way. God has a sense of humor. But maybe you're okay. You understand you don't need to use these and thous when you're talking to God. But most of us are Americans, and that also brings other challenges when it comes to prayer, I think, because we're taught, or at least I was taught, to be tough. I'm a tough girl from Alaska. I can do it. And we Americans, no matter what state you grew up in, you might have been taught to be self-sufficient, right? And pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Okay, now that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life, the more I think about it. I mean, if you've got straps on the back of your boots or your heels, you're going to pull yourself up by hanging on to them? Okay, how's this going to work? That makes no sense at all. You don't need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We can be bold in our prayers to God without going through weird contortions, and we don't have to be self-sufficient and tough when we turn to God. Fortunately, we have role models all around us. I like the writer of this Psalm 86, because he, like many other writers of the Psalms, didn't have any of these troubles about being bold. He didn't worry about being polite. He didn't worry about formulas. He didn't worry about trying to do it all by himself. The writers of the Psalms just put it right out there. And as you read them, you see often things were not going well for them. And they had no problem admitting to that, acknowledging their terror, their hurt, confusion, anguish, or bewilderness. They took it all right to God and laid it at God's feet, asking for help. The man who wrote Psalm 86 was in a horrible situation. A hateful group of people have struck terror into his heart. Not only that, they are lawless thugs. They really are. They reject God. He knows this. And they refuse to live by God's commandments. And they have set their sights on him and terrified him so much that he is shaking with fear as he says this prayer to God. But he does turn to God. He doesn't try to be strong. He doesn't try to use fancy words. He just lays it out there. He turns to God and says boldly, "Incline thine ear to me and answer me. O God, preserve my life. Give me your strength. Teach me your way, O Lord." This man knows he needs to learn God's way of dealing with things, because escaping these thugs that are threatening his life will require intensity and focus and clarity of concentration. This man knows he needs an undivided heart focused on God's ways in order to survive. He goes on to pray to God, "Give me a sign of your favor so that those who hate me may see it and be put to shame." Now this sounds like a little bit of revenge, perhaps, that he's asking for, but I don't think it is. What he's really praying for is that these troublemakers may come to know the Lord the way he does and be transformed by God. Maybe this is what Jesus meant when he said, "Love your enemies. Pray that they may come to know God and change their ways." This man was bold. He put it right out there before God. So that's one role model for us. There are so many others. One of my favorite writers is Anne Lamott, and she talks a lot about prayer. And she says one of her favorite prayers is very simple. It's just this: "Help me, help me, help me." That's putting it out there. Years ago, when I served a church down in Connecticut, I met another wonderful role model and got to see her prayer life in action. She'd been in the hospital for quite a while. I'm going to call her Martha. I always disguise the name, so don't worry. If I ever talk about you, I will disguise your name. I went to see Martha. She'd been in the hospital for a while, and she was pretty sick of it all. So I went in to see her, as I often did, and at the end of our visit, I said to her, "Well, why don't I say a prayer before I go? What would you like me to include in this prayer?" I often ask because people know what they need, and I'm happy to incorporate their prayers into mine. So I said, "Martha, what would you like me to say in this prayer to God?" And she said to me, "Tell him to get me out of here." So I did. "Dear Lord, you heard her. Get her out of here." She was bold. She was inspiring. I liked her a lot. I don't know if she inspired my prayer life sometimes, but she encouraged me to be bold. And one of my frequent prayers to God is this: Lord, you got me into this, you're going to get me out of it. And God does. That's a bold prayer. But like all these other prayers, help me, help me, help me, tell him to get me out of here, there's faith behind that prayer, a trust that God does love us steadfastly, and God is listening, and God will show us the way. The psalmist said, "You alone are God." That person knew that in times of trouble, God is the place to turn to. God is present and cares. God's been there in the past. God is there with us now. God will answer. But now here's the trick, because there's always a twist. We're called to be brave, to pray boldly, to put it out there, what we need, what we're longing for. But then, in order to hear what God does or says in response, we need to listen. So at this point, I invite you to take your candle out. On the bottom is a little black switch. Just turn that over. You may need to push it for a minute. And if you didn't get one, there's one waiting for you as you go out the doors. You got it? And let's just take a minute to look at these candles, the light of Christ in our lives, a reminder that God is always present to us. Let's take a few minutes just to listen as we look at this flickering flame. I encourage you to take these candles home with you to remind you that we always have the light of Christ and God's presence available to us. May these little lights strengthen you, give you the courage to pray boldly, to ask for what you need, and then to listen. Listen, for God will respond. Amen.